At this point in the years-long nightmare that is Lucy Letby's unsafe conviction and unfair incarceration for crimes that she did not commit, it is very clear that Dr. Ravi Jayaram, one of the main accusers who put her in prison, has told many falsehoods and untruths throughout this process, including in court, both in the first trial against Lucy Letby and in the second trial, where she was tried again for crimes against child K and found guilty for those crimes, which again, she did not commit. If this had been a sane court case, if it had not revolved around fantasy stories and fairy tales and lies and twisting of facts and manipulation of emotions of the jury so that the prosecution could get what the prosecution wanted, namely a conviction against Lucy Letby, then the questioning that I'm about to show you that Ben Myers demonstrated in his cross-examination of Ravi Jayaram in the first trial would have led to an understanding on the part of the jury that Ravi Jayaram's accusations are at best unbalanced and that there is no evidence or proof to back them up, and that in fact, he may even be an unreliable witness. So I'm going to show you how well Ben Myers eviscerated Ravi Jayaram on the stand. And also, just like he did with Stephen Breary, I'm going to show you how he corners Ravi Jayaram and facilitates his talking in circles so that if, again, we were in a sane courtroom and not a kangaroo court, it would have been very clear that all of this is a story coming from the depths of the minds of people who needed a reason to explain away the mistakes that they made. Now, of course, this cross-examination isn't the only thing that should prove to a jury that Lucy Letby was innocent, of course, but it's part of it. Let's begin with this cross-examination. So Myers says to Ravi Jayaram regarding child K, so if what you say is correct, what you have told us all things were like when you walked into that nursery, it turns out you weren't being irrational at all. And this is in response to Ravi Jayaram saying that he recognized that his suspicion against Lucy Letby doing something wrong while she worked with child K was probably coming from an irrational place, but that he went on that gut feeling, that intuition, and caught her in the act. And so initially he said to Myers that it was irrational, but then he realized that he was correct when he saw what she did. And this is where Myers is picking up. Jairam responds, in the sense that I really didn't want to walk in and find her in anything other than the condition she'd been in when Joe had left. That's Joe Williams, the other nurse on duty. But my reasons for walking in were not based on any clinical suspicion of baby K, although she was a premature baby, being at risk of an acute deterioration due to her underlying medical issues, which is an interesting thing to hear, considering the fact that Dr. Evans, the main medical expert witness for the prosecution, claimed that all the babies were well until Lucy Letby got her hands on them. So which is it? I think we know which it is, which is that the infants were not well, sadly. So Myers says, what you tell us you saw with Lucy Letby and what she was not doing goes to show, if you are right, that you were not being irrational in your concern. And Jairam says, in retrospect, no, which I guess is part of why we are here now. Because according to you, the woman you, one or more of your colleagues had decided was linked to an increase in incidents since June 2015 was there in highly suspicious circumstances, wasn't she? Jairam says, you mean, can you elaborate on what you mean by she was there in highly suspicious circumstances? You have described the scene to us, yes? But it wasn't suspicious that she was there. She was a nurse. She was asked to look after the baby. Myers responds, you told the police that you thought this might have been done on purpose. Jairam says, it's certainly one of the things that crossed my mind. That sounds pretty suspicious, doesn't it? That does, yes. Yes. So you're telling us the woman who had been identified by you and one or more of your colleagues as linked in some way to an increase in incidents was standing there in suspicious circumstances. In that context, yes. Meyer says, yes. You got her then. Jairam says, No, because I didn't see her doing anything. And actually, if I may say at this point, and you have made reference to this before about myself and my colleagues, we'd noticed this association, and more of these events were happening, and we really wanted to be able to have this investigated objectively in an appropriate way. And we, at that time, were really unclear as to how we could get this investigated in an appropriate way. Meyer says, right. Jayaram says, because there is absolutely no evidence that we could prove anything, because that's not our job as doctors. Our job is to notice patterns and raise concerns. And what I find really interesting is that I watched Chris Morris's video on Operation Hummingbird this morning. And he reminded us in the video that Paul Hughes proclaims that the police's job is to find patterns, and that the many Facebook searches and texts and the 500,000 documents they found in Lucy Letby's house didn't really prove anything. But if you look at the patterns behind them, Paul Hughes said, then you can create a suspectology, I believe he called it, and accuse Lucy Letby appropriately and then arrest her. And so I find it interesting that Jairam says in this exchange that pattern finding is what his job is. Interesting. I wonder how many conversations Jairam and Breary and Holt had with Paul Hughes and Nigel Wenham when they first went to that meeting and convinced them that Lucy Letby was guilty of things she didn't do. I wonder how much pattern recognition was discussed in those meetings. And I wonder if that is why Jairam has that word locked in his mind, a desperate attempt to explain what he was doing. Anyway, Myers responds, you agree. You did tell the police that confronted with what you saw, you wondered if the tube had been dislodged on purpose. It's interesting that Myers brings up the police at this point, isn't it? Considering what I just said about the pattern recognition thing. Maybe it's coincidence, but I do find it interesting. Jairam says, I did wonder that. And you have said to us now how this would have gone on for a certain period of time for the desaturation to reach this point. That's correct. So did you confront her? Absolutely not, Jairam says. It's my job at the time to deal with the baby. It's not my job to say that. This is someone who you're saying by this time you have linked to incidents on this department, yes? That's what you're telling us. Absolutely, Jairam says. It's someone you're saying is standing there when you walked in because of your suspicions, yes? Absolutely. It is someone who is standing there having done something that you told the police could have been done on purpose. It's a possibility, Jairam says, beginning to realize what he's being cornered into having to admit. If it happened the way you are describing it to us, you'd have asked her what was happening. No, I wouldn't, Jairam says. And the reason you didn't ask her is because it didn't happen in the way you're telling us, or rather told the police later. No. Well, I'm interested in why you say that, because what I have told you and what has been said is exactly my recollection of things. Interesting, Jairam. Interesting. Do you see anywhere in your note, clinical note, anything relating to suspicious circumstances of a dislodged tube? Well, Mr. Myers, that is not the sort of thing that one writes in clinical notes. It is, however, one of the things that we discussed as a team together and added to the list of concerns that we already had and escalated to senior management in the hospital. In fact, Myers says, there's no reference to dislodgement of a tube at all in the note, is there? Well, it's implicit that the tube wasn't in. You can from the fact that the tube, when we ventilated down it through hand, there was no change in the CO2. The chest wasn't moving, the tube wasn't blocked. The only reason that tube could not have been working was that it was not in. You don't make reference to any dislodgement, Myers says, because there was nothing suspicious at the time in your mind about a dislodgement, was there? There was a lot of suspicious in mind, because I still don't understand how a tube could have been dislodged, which, just to say, many medical professionals have let us know since this time that tiny infants often dislodge their breathing tubes on their own because they're active and it's such a tiny area to put a breathing tube in that it easily comes out. So this is just disingenuous at best from Jairam. Myers says, we don't in fact see a Datex report about this, do we? I didn't put a Datex in. No, Jairam says. A Datex is a standard form that's completed when something has happened that isn't right, isn't it? We often do them, yes, which in fact we know now that they did not do them enough, and that the only person who was dutiful in her Datex entry was Lucy Letby, and that Stephen Breary, her first and main accuser, was the one who read her Datex reports. And it is easy to assume here that Breary did not like being told by a nurse the things that had gone wrong on his quote unquote unit and may have been part of the driving force behind his accusation in the first place. However, we'll keep going. And Myers says, and this is more than just not right if you're telling us accurately, isn't it, Dr. Jairam? Jairam says, it's unusual. Unusual. You're saying it's suspicious and potentially deliberate. Potentially, yes. Deliberate harm by someone that you and your colleagues suspect of being associated with a series of events since June 2015. If you're right. Correct, Jairam says. And you don't even put a Datex report in, do you? I wasn't convinced that the Datex system was the correct way to investigate this because this event and any of these events in isolation would have been, not sure why that happened and not thought about it. But in the context of the pattern, they were more significant. And we, as a group of consultants, and this isn't just me or one or two colleagues, we, as a group of consultants by this stage, most of us has had experience of an unusual and unexpected event and had noticed this association with one particular nurse. Now, that is by no means us ascribing any kind of guilt. Yeah, right. But we were very concerned because not only was there the association with Nurse Letby, but all of these events were unusual. And yes, if we'd put Datex forms in for all of these things, perhaps patterns would have been recognized more quickly and perhaps we'd have been here sooner. But we didn't. However, we had a list of things that we were trying to raise with the senior management of the hospital, right back to the senior management again, blaming senior management for not doing his own job. And may I also remind everyone who is watching, who may not realize, that four of the main accusers, Gibbs, Breary, Jairam, and Holt, all were responsible for the deaths of children and the almost deaths of children because of mistakes that they made. And it's interesting that they were able to find patterns, quote unquote, in Lucy Letby's behavior in response to their own mistakes. Anyway, I'm not going to continue with the rest of his speech. Myers says, if someone does something to harm a baby, you just do nothing? And Jairam says, we didn't do nothing, Mr. Myers. We tried our best to escalate our concerns to the senior management of the hospital. First of all, you didn't escalate any concern with Ms. Letby on this occasion, did you? You didn't say a word to her. No, Jairam says. You didn't raise anything with the shift leader. No. You didn't put a Datex complaint in. No. At any point, as it happens, no. You don't make a note anywhere of what you're telling me happened, do you? In any record. I think the notes are very detailed. I mean, you don't put a note in these records of what you're saying is a person of interest standing there acting suspiciously and potentially dislodging an ETT because that's not the one of the thing one writes in medical notes. And at the time, I wasn't anticipating that several years later, I'd be sitting here talking to you. I don't even think that anything needs to be said about that. So you didn't do anything. I'm going to, though. So, Ravi, you didn't do anything at the time because you didn't realize that a story was going to need to be concocted because you'd be sitting in a courtroom years later, is what you're actually saying. Meyer says, you have a duty to look after the children on your unit, don't you? Jairam, yes, absolutely. Myers, if you think someone is deliberately harming them, you act to protect them, don't you? We did our best to act to protect them, as I say, by raising our concerns to the senior executive level medical management. At this point, Myers says, Concerns were very first raised before this by my colleague, Dr. Breary. And in February, I can't remember whether it was before or after this, we raised them again, which is interesting because it goes against Breary's claim that he wasn't thinking about this at all for the first year, except in passing, and that it wasn't specific because he was trying to defend himself against confirmation bias in my last video, in which Myers cross-examined him. Myers says, I make it plain. I don't accept the accuracy or truth of any allegation against the defendant on her behalf. But I'm just going through this from what you're saying at the moment, Dr. Jayaram, so we're not in any misunderstanding. Lucy Letby continued to work on this department for another 4 months or so, didn't she? That's correct. And then Jayaram says, later, if I may take a step back, and I've already said this, Mr. Myers, we had significant concerns, really, probably, certainly from the autumn of 2015. Really, probably, certainly. Okay. We escalated these concerns. They were on the radar of someone as senior as the executive director of nursing as far back as October 2015. As clinicians, we put our faith in the system, in our senior management, to guide us as to how to escalate these concerns and investigate them. You were guided to let it go because you had no evidence, Ravi Jayaram, and you didn't listen. This is the problem here. This is what you're being called out on, but you can't seem to admit it. The initial response was, it's very unlikely there's anything going on. See what happens. We said, okay, against our better judgment in retrospect. We flagged it up again in the February to the medical director and the director of nursing that we had concerns, and my colleague, Dr. Breary, who was the neonatal lead, requested to have a meeting with them. They didn't respond to that for another 3 months, and we were stuck because we had concerns and we didn't know what to do. In retrospect, we wish we had bypassed them and asked the police. All we wanted was to be advised as to the correct way forward in terms of investigating this association. We by no means had played judge and jury at any point, but the association was becoming clearer and clearer, and we needed to find the right way to do this. I would suggest that they did play judge and jury from the very beginning, but that's just my opinion. This is an unprecedented situation for us. Nobody trains us to deal with this. And as I have mentioned before, we work within a certain rule book and a certain playing field. We're not thinking, could this be deliberate harm initially? Yes, they were, but anyway. And these thoughts come into your head after a while and you put them away because it seems utterly preposterous. Then more and more happens, and then it is very easy sometimes then to start seeing things that aren't there. We are all aware of the concept of confirmation bias. Jayaram continues. If you buy a red car, you suddenly start noticing a lot of red cars. But even taking into account that there was a risk of confirmation bias and we were seeing things that actually weren't there, these episodes were becoming more and more and more frequent with this association. They were becoming more and more and more frequent because this unit could not handle level 2 babies and needed to be downgraded to level 1, which, as we know, it was. He continues, and yes, in retrospect, it's easy. We should have put Datex forms in. We should have written these specific concerns, maybe in the notes, but we didn't. But eventually it reached a point in June 2016 where we did say something has got to change. But that's not for me to talk about now, he says. Myers says, dealing with this specific incident you're describing to us, you raised no complaint with anyone at the time. Jayaram says, not to anybody on the neonatal unit, but I discussed this because I knew that we had a list of concerns already. You made no formal record at the time, did you? I didn't make a formal record at the time. And you and which other consultants we are talking about are all grown adults who don't need to be trained to call the police if someone is hurting babies, do you? The trouble is, at the time, it was one of a list of possibilities, and all we could see was the association. He's just admitting it. He's just outright admitting it here. It's amazing. I can't believe that the jury didn't see this or that it wasn't pointed out to them. I just can't believe it. No shade to the jury. They couldn't help it. They weren't equipped for this, but still. And we also, as I've alluded to before, we're beginning to get a reasonable amount of pressure from the senior management of the hospital not to make a fuss. And in retrospect, yes, absolutely, we're grown-ups and we should have stood up and not listened. And Myers says, and the significance of this event, if it happened in the way you said to the police some years later, is that this would have given you what you needed to make that complaint if you're telling the truth about it, Dr. Jayaram, wouldn't it? Jayaram says, are you suggesting that I'm not telling the truth? Yeah, that's exactly what he's suggesting. Myers says, first of all, do you agree once this happened, if it happened the way you say, you were in a position to go and make something of this, weren't you? Jayaram says, in this isolated incident, absolutely not, because it was an association. I didn't see her do anything. So sometimes it's an association where he shouldn't do anything, and sometimes it's not. It's wow. I didn't see her do anything, but I still find it very difficult to understand why in that short period of time when baby K had been stable, poorly, but stable, and Joe Williams left, she had this deterioration. I also don't understand why an alarm didn't go off. And even if an alarm didn't go off, I don't understand when it was clear she was desaturating. I wasn't called or someone hadn't raised an alarm. You did nothing at the time, Dr. Jairam, Meyer says. I resuscitated baby K, he responds. Nothing in terms of a complaint. No, Jairam says, because there was no suspicion that Ms. Letby had interfered with anything or failed to act. Jairam says, I think there's an element, that's the truth of it, isn't it? Meyer says. The truth of it is that we're thinking the unthinkable. And as with anyone, when one first hears about these things, you don't want to believe it, just as I had this instinct. And in retrospect, I wish we had. But actually, we did add it to the list of concerns that we wanted to discuss with senior hospital executive medical and nursing management for advice as to how to proceed. And in retrospect, were I ever in such a situation again, and I sincerely hope I never ever am, I would have no hesitation in bypassing the apparent correct lines of communication. Meyer says, because raising an issue, if things had happened the way you're telling us, is the obvious thing to do, isn't it? It is, Jairam says. And you didn't, did you? We did. We raised it, as I say, with senior hospital management. And in fact, Meyer says, the suggestion that Ms. Letby did the sort of things, or rather didn't do them in the way you're saying now, is something that you said to the police years later when they interviewed you, isn't it? We'd been saying it or wondering about that association from that time, and it took a long time for the police to be involved. Meyer says, could we look at tile 103, please, in the prosecution schedule of events? It says, call received from Dr. Jairam. Baby dislodged the tube and had to be reintubated. Do you see that? Jairam says, yes, I would probably have said that the tube was dislodged. I don't think I'd have said the baby dislodged it. In the normal scheme of things, if a tube is going to be dislodged, it's most likely dislodged by the baby. Okay, there you go. What are you getting at then? But in a 25-weeker who's not vigorous and not moving around with a tube that's in to a good length and secured, not the case at all. And it's a very unlikely thing to happen. And I don't know if it did happen, it happened in that window. Meyer says, this is in the material that we have, Dr. Jairam. Do you agree? If it says that, do you agree you said that? I can't remember what words I used. That's what's recorded there. Yes, Meyer says. And actually, it's more likely in the general scheme of things that a baby would, but it's also very unlikely that a small 25-week gestation baby would have dislodged a tube. It can happen when babies are being handled. There was no reason for baby K to have been handled. It can happen during cares. It can happen if a baby is very vigorous. That's usually with bigger, heavier, more robust, stronger babies. And in that situation with somebody watching the baby, it would have been witnessed, and it's likely to have been seen by the nurse looking after the baby. Meyer says, first of all, a baby like baby K, as she was at that point, is capable of dislodging a tube by her own movement, isn't she? Except she wasn't really moving very much. And I think that's still very unlikely. It's possible, as is anything possible. But I don't think in my time looking after small premature babies that I have seen a baby at this stage who's not vigorous with a tube that's secured dislodge a tube. And by the way, just to say, I believe it was Joanne Williams who was the other nurse on duty, but one of the nurses claimed that baby K was not still, that baby K was actually very vigorous. And so it would be likely that baby K would dislodge a tube. But anyway, Meyer says, do you recall ever telling the police that tubes can get dislodged by very active babies? Jairam says, it can happen, but she wasn't a very active baby. I'm going to come to that. Let's deal first of all in principle. In principle, yes. An active premature baby can dislodge a tube, can't she or he? If they're very active, but a baby of this weight and this size at this stage, and actually, Meyer says, that's what you thought had happened at the time, isn't it? Jairam says, I thought the tube Well, the tube had been dislodged because there's nothing else that could have been going on at that point. Okay, so if there's nothing else that could have been going on at that point, then why is Lucy Letby guilty of doing this? Myers says, and if you had seen Miss Letby doing or not doing what you say, you wouldn't be suggesting it was the baby that had dislodged that tube, would you? Jayaram says, I think again, the thought in my head was, has this been done deliberately? I'm not going to say this to the receiving consultant at the other end, and I would probably have said that the tube was dislodged. The interpretation would be that the baby had dislodged the tube because obviously the receiving consultant isn't going to assume that it has been done by anybody else. Myers says, we can take that down. Thank you. You told the jury earlier on that the ventilator was not alarming. Jayaram says, that's correct. Certainly that wasn't what prompted me. I didn't hear an alarm as I walked in. You've just given evidence this morning. The ventilator, you were asked about it. You were asked about the alarm. You said the ventilator was not alarming. That was your evidence, wasn't it? Jayaram says it wasn't alarming, and the monitor was not alarming either. And a ventilator not alarming, that makes it sound more suspicious, doesn't it? Potentially. Yes. In fact, and you can look at this if it helps, isn't your actual recollection that you can't recall whether it was sounded? Jayaram says, it wasn't sounding. Well, the reason I got up from where I was sitting wasn't because I heard an alarm going off. And in the anatomy of the neonatal unit, the alarms are loud, and I would have gone in had I heard the alarm. Do you dispute that the alarm sounded, Dr. Jayaram? I don't recall it going off, and that's not why I went in. And certainly when I went in and I walked in, I don't remember the alarm going off, because if the alarm had been going off, that's what would have prompted me to stand up and go through. Myers says, do you remember having a conversation with Nurse Williams when you went over at some point after the desaturation? Jayaram says, I will have had a conversation to sort of say, her tube's out and and she desaturated and we've had to re-intubate her, but I can't remember when Nurse Williams came back and what point in the proceedings she came back. Myers says, you asked her who was in the room when the alarm went off. That's something you said to her, wasn't it? Jayaram says, I can't remember. Myers says, you asked her what had happened. Do you recall that? I asked Ms. Williams, Jayaram says. Do you recall asking? She wasn't in the room when I went in. Was this for the first incident? No, after the first incident. Do you recall asking Joanne Williams what happened? No, because she wasn't in the room. Myers says, yes. Jayaram says, she might have asked me what happened. Myers says, because if things happen in the way you're saying, you wouldn't need to ask Joanne Williams, who came back later, what had happened, would you? I didn't ask. I didn't. Well, why would I have asked her what happened? Because she wasn't in the room when it happened. Myers says, I'm going to suggest you did ask her who was there when the alarm went off because you heard an alarm go. You could hear an alarm ringing. Jayaram says, no, I don't recall that at all. That's not my recollection in the slightest, because had I heard an alarm going, that would have been the prompt for me to go in. So now, just one more thing. I'm going to show you where Joanne Williams acknowledges that Ravi Jayaram asked her what happened when the alarm went off. This was earlier in the day, after Williams had been questioned by Astbury on the prosecution side. Now Myers is cross-examining her, and he says, you explained to us the process where if vital signs, as recorded by the monitor, fall below a certain level, an alarm or alarms will sound. Is that correct? Williams says, yes. Myers says, when you came back on the unit after being away for was it a relatively short period you were away? Williams says, I can't remember, sorry. You came onto the unit and you heard an alarm sounding, didn't you? Yes. An alarm was going off. You were asked questions about what you can recall regarding a conversation with Dr. Jayaram when you came back on the unit. Do you remember being asked these questions? Yes. I'm going to assist you, if I can, by asking you just to look at the statement that you made, Ms. Williams, on 10 April 2018, just to see what you said then. That was closer to the time of the events that we're dealing with. Is it likely that's probably going to have a little bit more accurate detail than you recall as you sit here now? Williams says, when I gave the statement, yes. Myers says, all right, just looking at the passage, after he's found the passage to show her. If you read the first 3 or 4 lines to yourself, please, Mrs. Williams. There's a pause while she reads it. The issue arising, Myers continues, is what it was that was said. That's what this relates to. The first thing is when you first returned to the unit. Dr. Jayaram wasn't in nursery one, was he? He wasn't in the room where baby K was. Williams says, I don't know. Myers says, when you spoke to him, was this in the corridor outside the room as far as you know? Williams says, I remember I wasn't in nursery one. It's not in nursery one. And he was asking you things like, what's happened? How's this happened? That's what he was asking you, isn't it? Yes, Williams says. And you were replying something like, I don't know. I wasn't here. I was with the parents. Williams says, yes. Myers says, certainly at the time you made your statement, Mrs. Williams, you remember him asking you who was in the room at the time the alarms went off. Williams says, yes. So that's something he asked, Myers said. Who was in the room at the time the alarms went off? Williams says, yes. Myers says, he wanted to know? Williams says, yes. Even before all of Jayram's untruths came out, even though he said that Lucy Letby hadn't done anything while she was standing over the cot of child K, that in fact emails surfaced a year after the trial showing that in the notes he sent to his colleagues at the time of the event, he said that the nurse did call him for help, so he had lied about that. The fact that he keeps changing his story about hearing the alarms and about the swipe card data not matching the story he's told and being called in by the police to figure out a way to adjust their testimony so that they can match the door swipe data. All of this, even before all of this came out, Myers does a brilliant job of showing what an unreliable witness Ravi Jayaram is. It's right there. It's right there. This is a very long 10-month trial. These people in the jury have been listening to madness for months. I don't even know if they heard this. I don't even know if they read it when they were deliberating. But if they had, I posit that this would have changed the outcome of this trial, or at least it should have, because this man is clearly the most generous I can be, not fully in his balance as he shares this information, probably because he's terrified. Because deep down, if not on the surface, deep down, he knows that this is all a story concocted to protect the consultants from their own mistakes. And this cross-examination shows that so clearly. I know there are a lot of things that Ben Myers did that were mistaken and wrong. But from what I've seen in his cross-examination, if anyone was listening, if his words weren't being thrown to the ether, it would be clear what the truth is here. And just like Lucy Letby was expected to be found guilty, even if they can't find causes of murders, because you just lump all these cases together and it proves one big crime, then Ben Myers' cross-examinations of all of these people, when put together, should have shown that there was no crime. And yet it didn't happen. And ideally, when the CCRC refers this back to the Court of Appeal, the prosecution realizes that they have no leg to stand on, doesn't decide to bring it back to court, and Lucy Letby is exonerated because that's what should happen.